Okay, so let's go through the animal body plan. We're going to be comparing some of these things through the groups of organisms that we're going to cover. The animal body plan is basically like it's morphological, which is kind of like its body form, and developmental complexity, which is also called a grade instead of a clade. A clade is just a group with similar things. Kind of hard to tell the exact difference between those. And make sure you read about that. But anyway, we're going to talk about symmetry first. So symmetry is how the body is organized. So there's two basic ways. There's one called radial and one called bilateral. The radial is where it radiates out from a central point. In essence, it would be the same no matter where you put the lines through the body. So, for example, an anemone like this has radial symmetry. A starfish has radial symmetry. So those are things that perhaps that you know. Bilateral is by far the more common, and that would be something that you can divide down the middle, and it would be kind of the same on one side versus the other. So on each lateral side, the left and the right, it's roughly the same. In bilateral symmetry, there is a bunch of words that kind of go with this. So let's just kind of, I'll just stand back so you can sort of write them down. But first, let's go over each one of these things. So dorsal is the top, and ventral is the bottom. So a lot of times they'll refer to, say, for example, internal structures as dorsal or ventral, so that you know in the body orientation where it's located. Of course, lateral is on the sides, either left or right. Anterior is the front. Posterior is the rear. And cephalization means that it has a head region. So some of the simpler organisms may only have some minor sensory organs in the front, and then as things become more complex, you're going to see more orientation or more cephalization. So that's something that we're going to talk about. All right. So the next thing is tissues. If you have tissues, what that means is that you have cells that are doing the same thing, or in other words, they have a common function. So there are three basic tissues that all animals have, and in later animals, like in us, for example, we have 4 tissue layers. But anyway, the ectoderm is the outside tissue layer, and of course that's for protection and so forth. And sometimes it's involved in the nervous system formation because it's sensory. You have the endoderm, which is lining the gut. So this is sometimes connected with the digestive system. Sometimes there's some other organs that are sort of offshoots of that. And then you have the mesoderm. And the mesoderm is the in-between tissue, in between the ectoderm and the endoderm. Typically, this is muscles, or it might be most of the major organ systems are somewhat derived from that. All right, so you have 2 basic types of organisms that in terms of tissues. You have what is called diploblastic. That would be that it only has 2 cell layers thick, and the 2 cell layers are the ectoderm and endoderm. So these are very simple organisms. They do not have a mesoderm. A triploblastic organism has all 3 cell layers, and in higher level organisms, perhaps even more. All right. So there is something then, if you have 3 cell layers, called a body cavity. And it doesn't exist in all organisms. The body cavity is called a coelom. There's 3 basic types of organisms in terms of their body cavity. And that is, oops, I got the wrong thing there. That is something that we call an acoelomate, a pseudocoelomate, or a coelomate. All right. So what this means is, and of course this is an order of complexity. If you are an acoelomate, you literally don't have an internal body cavity. You have the 3 tissue layers, you're triploblastic, but you don't have any space in between. So basically, your digestive tract, and you have the you have the endoderm, you have the ectoderm, and the mesoderm is mainly muscle tissue. Okay, so this is very simple organisms like a flatworm, like in this picture. A pseudocoelomate has all three tissue layers also, but it does have a space. And the space is, it can be, I think, on the outside also, but it basically is just one area that is open, and that's where either it can be filled with fluid and act kind of like what they call a hydroskeleton. In other words, kind of like a rigid, sort of blowing up a balloon or something, like a rigid structure that the muscles that are part of the mesoderm can act around. So this would enable things to wiggle, like this worm here, but it's not enabling very complex movement. And as you get a coelomate, you have a body cavity that is lined on both sides with muscles. So then you can have opposing muscles. In other words, muscles going one way and muscles going the other way, and you can get more defined movement. Also, as this happens, a lot of times that area now is things are becoming more complex, and you'll have more organs, and this is where the organ systems lie. And things like, for example, parts of your digestive tract, like your liver, or parts of your reproductive system, or something like that, are going to lie within that cavity that is completely sterile and completely not exposed to the outside. All right, so it's kind of a nice little chamber. So imagine, for example, your stomach. It allows your stomach, as you eat, to get bigger, and then when you digest, it gets smaller. So it allows expansion and contraction of the organs. Think of your heart. Of course, it's beating, so it allows expansion and contraction. So that's basically how the coelom acts in higher level organisms. There can be something called mesenteries. These are structures that suspend the organs within that cavity. In other words, they kind of keep them in place and keep them from shifting around. And so that's all part of the body cavity system. All right. Now the last thing is a pattern of development. So this is different for different organisms, and there's two basic types. So let's just go over these. There's protostomes. Here, I'll put this up there. Protostomes and deuterostomes. All right. And so the protostomes, helps if I have it right side up and visible. Okay. So these are protostomes on this side and deuterostomes on this side. By far, there's only two big groups, two big phyla that we're going to talk about that are deuterostomes. Of the other 35 phyla, they are all protostomes. So this is by far the more common. All right, now these, it's not real easy to remember this. So this is something that you're going to have to spend a little time trying to remember. The protostomes, remember that 8-cell stage that we talked about. In the 8-cell stage, it has what they call spiral cleavage and also determinate. What the spiral means is that the cells are offset from one another, one layer, and then the next layer of cells are somewhat offset, as opposed to radial. See how they're right on top of each other. Determinate also means that these cells, as they are developed, basically they become what they're going to be based on where they are. All right. Whereas indeterminate means that they are going to migrate, and as they end up where they are after they migrate, then they're going to become what they are. But at first, they could go one way or another, and wherever they end up, then they're going to become the tissue in which they're in, or the organ or whatever. Okay, so this is called cleavage. The second thing that is part of this is what they call coelom formation. Okay, so how did the coelom form? So you have the schizocoelus, which is the protostomes, and what happens there is, so remember the blastula, which is the ball of cells, and then you have the gastrulation forming, that is the pushing in of this blastopore. So remember, I already talked about the thumb pushing in. Then you have the mesoderm forming, and what happens here is that the coelom, which is the cavity in between the mesoderm pieces, in other words, this is a little ball of cells inside of the now a gastrula, and this is going to push out and grow and fill in this whole area surrounding the endoderm. Okay, so this is the gut cavity here, or digestive tube, and you have the mesoderm then on the inside and the outside with the space, the coelom in between. So basically this grows up, right? It's going to grow up, all right? So that's schizocoelous. As the other type which is enterocoelous, what happens is these mesoderm forms as an offshoot of the top of the gastrula, or the, as the gut is going through, it's going to start at the top there, and it's going to grow down and fill that area. So it's going to come out and grow down. All right, so that's a little bit different, and it's starting at the opposite end, okay? So that's a real big difference in actually its pattern of development. And in the protostomes, at first, so this basic blastopore is going to become the mouth. So it's going to push all the way through and become the anus. On the deuterostomes, the first in pushing becomes the anus, and it's going to go all the way through and become the mouth. So this is opposite ends in terms of where the mouth is located. So they're very different at the, they look about the same at the end, right? But they're very different in how they got there. Both this and this are opposite ends of that. Okay, so we're going to talk about, as we go through the groups, just some general trends. So one trend is from water to land, and of course the other trend is simple to complex. And we're going to be comparing the organ systems of groups. So let's just talk about that for a second. So remember that tissues, like we were just saying, tissues are groups of cells with a common function. And then as you put together, if you put all the tissue layers together into one thing, it's called an organ. And usually this has to do with something that has a specific job, like your stomach, for example. And then you have organ systems, which are tying together the different organs within for a particular function. So let's say, for example, digestive. In us, we have organs of the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestines, the large intestines, and we have other organs associated with that, like the liver, the gallbladder, the pancreas, etc. And those are all part of one big system that has to do with food intake and output, okay? So that basically then, as we go through these groups, we're going to talk more about this later, that is the organ systems and so forth, and we're going to do it, of course, invertebrates, mainly human systems. But as we go through the groups, we're going to kind of compare. So at first, everything is just doing it on the cellular level. In other words, when things are super simple, they're just a couple of cell layers thick. In other words, they are diploblastic, and every cell has contact with the outside. So it can get its food. It's going to use food for energy source and for materials, molecules that it needs to make other molecules in the cell. And it can get rid of the food waste directly to the water that is outside of it. It's also going to get oxygen and get rid of the carbon dioxide waste directly to the outside. So input of oxygen and removal of CO2. And it will also get rid of nitrogenous waste, which it comes from the breakdown of proteins. So remember that proteins are what make up enzymes, and enzymes are used over and over and over again to do many cell processes, and they break down and they end up being kind of toxic to the cell, so the cell has to get rid of that. So on a cellular level, most single-celled organisms are doing just that, just like in and out to the water or whatever substrate they're in or on. As the complexity goes up, then the body has organs and organ systems. So it will have a digestive system. This has to do with food input and out. It will have a respiratory system, oxygen in, CO2 out, or an excretory system, nitrogenous waste in, or nitrogenous waste out only. And it could have then some kind of sensory organs, which are part of the nervous system. And as it gets more complex, we'll have a brain and nerve cords and such. Of course, most organisms are going to have some kind of reproduction. At first, we might have external fertilization, and then as we go through and get more complex, we'll have internal. Remember, this is water to land, so if you think about that, that makes some sense, protecting the reproductive structures inside. Cardiovascular, that connects the digestive, excretory, and respiratory systems with some kind of fluid, and it can have a heart or not. You would not have a cardiovascular system if you did not have a digestive, respiratory, and excretory system. So you got to have those things first. So in other words, this is in a more complex organism. And then there's other systems too that we're not going to really compare because there's not generalizations or not easy generalizations to make, like the endocrine system or the muscular system or the skeletal system or something along those lines. So the main ones that we're going to compare are the ones right here.